In some recent videos, I've mentioned I'm in the middle of a New Jedi Order / Legacy era reread. The last strictly lore-related video I did spoke about how the New Jedi Order series has Luke struggling to find the identity of the Jedi Order, mirroring how the Old Order was just being developed in the prequel trilogy at the same time. Today I wanted to talk about another parallel I picked up between the NJO series and the prequels, a comparison between the Separatists, technically just the Trade Federation specifically at the time, in The Phantom Menace, and the Yuuzhan Vong. This chiefly comes through with the Battle of Dantooine in Darkside Onslaught, one of the opening battles of the Yuuzhan Vong War, and how it mirrors the Battle of Naboo in The Phantom Menace. While the similarities between the battles themselves stuck out to me at the time, what they say about the two factions is, in my opinion, pretty interesting as well. I'm going to generally refer to the Trade Federation as part of the CIS throughout the video, even though that's technically anachronistic. The CIS is, of course, way more than just the Trade Federation, and it didn't exist yet as of The Phantom Menace, but the points I'm talking about apply pretty equally to them as a whole group and the Trade Federation individually, so it's just easier to refer to the CIS directly, rather than to continue making a distinction for the purposes of this video. The Yuuzhan Vong were a species of extragalactic aliens who invaded the Star Wars galaxy in 25 ABY, or years after the Battle of Yavin, striking from Cernpidal in the galactic north and Helska, and successfully conquering much of the Star Wars galaxy, though they had been spying on and prepping for their invasion for decades, having been driven from their own war-torn galaxy, after killing off almost every other species in it, save for themselves and the Chazrak, a reptilian species kept by the Yuuzhan Vong as slaves. The Yuuzhan Vong had their own Pantheon of Gods. They were not really part of the Force, which is one of the things that make them unique, and the idea of pain and honor played foundational roles in their society and religion. Key among their beliefs, especially when it came to their goals within the Star Wars galaxy, was a complete revulsion for mechanical artificial technology. This especially applied to artificial life forms like droids. Instead, the Yuuzhan Vong grew and used organic, often sentient life forms to serve as everything from communication devices to their largest warships. This technological revulsion stemmed from a major war in their own home galaxy between two very powerful droid factions, the Silentium and the Abominor. The Silentium originally appeared in the form of Vufi Ra from the Lando Calrissian adventures, and the Abominor originally appeared in a 1982 Empire Strikes Back comic named Rust Never Sleeps, sort of, though they're most identified with a character named the Great Heap in Star Wars Droids. Both of these are, of course, retcons after the fact where the Abominor and Silentium weren't things when Vufi Ra, the Great Heap, and the Runyards were made up, with Runyards being what was in the 1982 comic, but they were later pulled into the greater canon and tied into the Yuuzhan Vong's backstory in this way. The Yuuzhan Vong drove off both the Silentium and the Abominor after their war brought the two to the Yuuzhan Vong homeworld of Yuuzhan Tar, and this left the Vong as essentially the unquestionable powers of their home galaxy. So with this revulsion to technology, it would seem that the Yuuzhan Vong would be polar opposites of the CIS, an almost entirely droid-centric faction, but the ways in which they're expressed within the Clone Wars and pre-Clone Wars conflicts, but again, not super worth making that distinction every single time, and the Yuuzhan Vong War have some thematic similarities. The Battle of Dantooine, a plain-covered world not unlike Naboo, was one of the earliest battles of the Yuuzhan Vong War, happening about 2 months after the initial invasion forces landed. Refugee convoys from the nearby worlds of Dubrillion and Destrillion were forced to stop at Dantooine, unaware of the impending Yuuzhan Vong attack. Assisted by Lando, Luke, and Leia, Mary Jade and the Solo children, some of whom had come with the refugees, and others who had been on planet for different reasons, like Mara was there to recover from a disease that was eating away at her. Much like the Gungans and Naboo security forces, the refugees and the Jedi were forced to fend for themselves against an overwhelming invasion force. The New Republic was still somewhat dragging its heels on involvement, despite pleas from Leia and other supporters, looking to help relieve the onslaught in the Outer Rim, and warning that the core would be under threat too in the not-too-distant future. The Yuuzhan Vong weren't just some regional threat. This was very reminiscent of Leia's mother, Padme Amidala, and her own pleas to the Republic Senate for assistance against the threat of the Trade Federation, before the CIS began their own full assault on the Republic. In the Battle of Naboo, the primary forces of the Trade Federation army were battle droids, controlled from orbit by a central processing system within the Lucrehulk droid control ship. The structure of the Yuuzhan Vong forces, despite their revulsion of technology, is much the same fundamentally. Their army did include independent Yuuzhan Vong warriors, but the bulk of their overwhelming forces were made up of slaves, primarily Chazrak, who were controlled by a large, beetle-like organism called a thrall herder. These Yuuzhan Vong thralls were similar to the droids, though far more brutal and arguably more mindless. Despite the revulsion of technology as being an affront to the will of the gods, the Vong essentially stripped these other living beings of their agency for the purposes of the Vong war effort, though this too was done in the name of their gods. While not anywhere near to the same extent, most Vong battle coordination was handled by a centralized computer of some sort, a tactical overseer known as a Yammisk. It became a common goal within the major battles of the Vong War to take out ships carrying the Yammisks, or the parts of the planet that had the Yammisks in them, and covert ops would often target immature growing Yammisks. This again mirrors early CIS reliance on things like the droid control ships at Naboo, and the victory of the New Republic over the Chazrak forces comes from an assault on the Thrall herders that's actually very similar in structure to Anakin's run on the droid control ship in The Phantom Menace. As the Clone Wars approached and progressed, the droid forces did become less centralized and more independent, but there were still similar elements present, much like the Yuuzhan Vong Yammisks. And it's again important to remember that The Phantom Menace was the only prequel movie out for the majority of the New Jedi Order's run. I mentioned it in the previous video about Luke's Jedi Order, but I did ask Troy Denning, one of the authors of the New Jedi Order series, which was 19 books split up between multiple different authors, and he said that as far as he went at least, and he did one of the later books in the series, Star by Star, the authors didn't really have access to information about what George was doing with the prequels. More important than these direct parallels between the battles with these two factions are the thematic underpinnings they represent. While in many ways the Vong were a departure from previous enemies, they still cover a lot of similar themes, some of which I'd like to flesh out more in future videos as I continue my reread and refresh myself on more of the war, if you guys are interested. Star Wars has always associated its villains with some kind of loss of identity and individuality. We can see this with the stormtroopers as the helmeted, faceless enemies of the Empire, while rebel soldiers almost always have their faces visible. Even when they're in their fighters, their helmets are designed in such a way that you can still see them as individual people compared to the TIE fighter pilots. And you can see similar things with the leading forces in these factions. For much of the original trilogy, you don't see too much of Palpatine's face. Vader is wearing a mask in the prequel trilogy. You get kind of Sidious as this hooded, shadowy figure hiding the fact that it's actually Palpatine. So there's some similarities there about the idea of loss of identity and control that you get with the way that the Yuuzhan Vong use their Chazrak slaves, and they use some of the humans and other species from the Star Wars galaxy that they regularly capture and try to essentially turn into the same thing. In Episode 1, the same goes for the Naboo troopers and Gungans versus the droids as an army of uniform, unthinking, and unstoppable enemies. The clones even fit into this to some extent, though they're arguably the good guys of the Clone Wars. As precursors to the Clone Wars, they're as much a warning of what was to come as anything, and then their involvement in Order 66 happens. And a lot of the stories that we got about the clones later were the types of stories that tried to humanize them, that tried to stop them from being this monolithic mass of faceless, nameless troopers that just follow their orders. Some of them refusing to be a tool of these evil forces behind the scenes. A further parallel with this comes the idea of a villainous faction being the result of an unseen entity playing them against often their own best interests and desires, stoking their worst instincts and promoting conflict from behind the scenes, leading to the rot within the Republic, playing up some of the discontent within the CIS, and that kind of thing. In the Clone Wars and the original trilogy, the source of this is, of course, Palpatine and the Sith. In the Yuuzhan Vong War, it's the work of agents like Nam Aenor and Chief Leo Nimi, pet of the Supreme Overlord Shimra, but in reality, the true leader of the Yuuzhan Vong, claiming to have access to a set of information known as the 8th Cortex, which was supposed to give the information the Vong needed to beat the infidel inhabitants of the galaxy, furthering the belief that their conquest was not just righteous, but a mandated duty that they all had to fulfill from the gods themselves. It was only once they discovered that this was not the case that individuals like Na-Manor started to turn against the goals of Onemi and Shimra, and sometimes actively even fought against the other Yuuzhan Vong. By the end of the war, having removed the influence of Onemi and Shimra, the rest of the Yuuzhan Vong are allowed to live on Zonema-Sikot and kind of rebuild their society. The Yuuzhan Vong have always been a contentious part of the Star Wars lore, and while I'm personally a big fan of the NJO, some of that comes as a result of it being one of my first introductions to the expanded universe, so it's what shaped my expectations of what Star Wars books would be. So I understand why it's somewhat jarring for some people, where it's a very different tone from some of the earlier Bantam books where it's more based on warlord threats of the day. There's less of an existential threat present. There isn't the same willingness to kill off characters that came with the New Jedi Order era and later. So hopefully you've still enjoyed this video, even if it doesn't convince you of some of the parallels and connections that the Vong have to other themes and parts of Star Wars. I wouldn't go as far as saying which parts are or aren't intentional, but these kinds of connections, intentional or not, have always been one of the most interesting parts of Star Wars and other types of media to me. If you have enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like or subscribing for more, and if you have any other ideas for topics you'd like to see me cover, leave those in the comments as well. The last week I haven't had many videos coming out. The last lore video was over a week ago, so sorry for that. I am working on getting a better schedule set up because I do intend to have 2 to 3 lore videos on the channel per week, plus TabCaf transmissions, of course, every Thursday. So I'm still working out how to get all that happening, along with the stuff I'm doing on Corey Loses. I've got my laptop back from my girlfriend. She was borrowing it for some school stuff earlier, and that actually will help a lot because it means I can use my desktop to render these videos. The graphical updates have taken a lot longer to render than the previous style of videos do. I think it's worth the upgrade there, or worth the extra downtime I have there, but with my laptop I'll be able to work on things like scripting videos in a way that's not really possible when my computer is rendering for 4 hours at a time. So hopefully we should be back on track with more content coming soon. Either way, hope you've enjoyed the video, thank you for watching, and hope to see you next time. Bye everyone.